Hello and welcome to Rainbow History Class, the show where we teach you the queer and trans history that you don't, or probably don't, or most definitely don't, depending on where you are, get in school. My name is Rudy Jean Rigg and I'm here with Hannah.
Hi, thanks for tuning in. I'm very excited about the Easter holidays.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Do you like Easter? Because I want to rebrand Easter, but I want to hear your thoughts first.
I mean, I don't have any connection to Easter, the religious holiday, or even the, pagan celebration. But in terms of a long weekend, hot cross buns.
Love them.
I'm into it. And I'm also into, okay, so I guess Easter is the ultimate Christian girl autumn time.
Yeah, but like not. Yes, in Australia.
In Australia. Because
yes.
I think the thing is I've been feeling really nostalgic for fall, even though I've never experienced fall.
What do you mean? We always have autumn.
Yeah, we have autumn. But, I just feel that fall is so much more than a season. It's a personality. It's a state of mind.
It's a lifestyle.
It's a lifestyle. Like I've never had a pumpkin spice latte.
What?
No,
in the fall because it's always out.
or
in
ever.
spring. Really? I have like a whole bottle of like pumpkin spice like syrup concentrate.
Wow. See, I don't have anything like that. I think for me, I get excited about autumn because I love crunching leaves and eating hot cross buns. And for some reason, I always get really sad in a happy way in autumn. Like it's got like poignancy to it, nostalgia, bittersweetness as a season. And I can't put my finger on it.
I feel like too. I feel like so in my family growing up, we really we're not a religious family. Like I didn't grow up in religion. My mom and I guess my sister and I kind of like had like a bit of a roll around and like, Wiccan sort of practices and stuff when I was younger, but like we really like value and I suppose, I don't know, take heed in like the change of seasons and we really kind of lean into it. So yeah, for me, it has like a lot of nostalgia as well. Like my mom and I are actually doing our like sort of annual Easter time Queen Victoria Market trips this week, kind of to mark the season.
What do you get?
So, well, I don't really get anything. So I like to sort of just like take it all in. I like to just kind of like feel overstimulated in the fruit and vegetable section.
It's easy to feel overstimulated at that market.
Yeah. And, we sort of walk around the deli aisles and, I'm vegan, so I don't eat most of what's in the deli aisles, but like, it's just a very nice experience to like kind of go and it's getting cooler. So you might have like a cozy jacket on and
yeah, but it's crisp. It's in here in Melbourne. Oh, yeah. Autumn is crisp.
Yeah. And you're like getting a coffee and you're getting like a bunch of flowers and
maybe even a couple of hot cross buns.
Exactly. And you know what? The offering for gluten-free vegan hot cross buns is getting better.
I would hope so because what they have, the abomination that they have in the supermarkets here, there is like a pizza-shaped hot cross bun and all of these weird recipes like in the free magazine that you get in the supermarket, which I love.
Yeah, me too.
And I hope they continue. I saw this recipe that was like a hot cross bun, bacon and egg sandwich. And I was like, no, like a hot cross bun is fine.
Well, I would, back when I ate bacon
and eggs.
Yeah. There is a way to do it. I think you got to like French toast fire the hot cross bun.
And then we're getting into like Canadian bacon and maple syrup kind of spicy vibes. I get it. But I just think that like hot cross buns are objectively just a flawless food.
Yes.
That doesn't need to be fucked with.
But you have to like, I think the premise to enjoying a hot cross bun is that you have to like fruit in baked goods and or like a level of like baking spices. And if you don't like those two things, I can understand why you would never like a hot cross bun unless you went for like the shapes flavored ones or like yeah.
Something I've always been really embarrassed about is the fact that I quite like dried fruit.
Why are you embarrassed?
I think it's really embarrassing. And I think it comes down to this thing that I have. One thing I can't deal with is people that make not having a sweet tooth part of their personality and they'll drop it in the introduction to meeting them.
Oh, it's not for me. Yeah,
it's just like, sweet, I just prefer savory over sweet. For me, it was like classic when I was dating, and I am going to throw Hannah under the bus here because she did tell me this when we started dating, and I was like, oh. But like, I swear I went on so many dates with girls where they all just wanted to tell me that they were more into savory than sweet. And for some reason, I think it's just like an entry level personality quirk. And so after that, I felt really embarrassed that I like things like dried fruit. I like raisin toast. And you know what else? I like prunes.
Prunes are good. What, they're just plums that are dried. Plums are very sweet and tart.
I feel like they have this like old lady baggage that I feel embarrassed about liking prunes. I feel embarrassed about liking rum and raisin chocolate.
It's the best. Okay, listen, hear me out. I have liked this, I would call it genre of food since the day I was born. I came out of the womb. I came out of the C-section rather, absolutely loving 3 things.
Milk?
No, I didn't because I was undiagnosed celiac and my mum was too, so I was not having it. But I came out loving like dried fruit and things. Do you know what my favorite cereal was as a baby and still is now?
Sultana Brown?
Yeah.
Mine too. I love Sultana Brown.
It's so good. I love raisin toast, Sultana Brown, that kind of stuff. Anything with dried fruit, love it. Fruit cake at Christmas time. My mom says I didn't like it. Maybe I didn't, but like I feel like I ephemerally like it now. I love like cruciferous vegetables. So like Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cabbage. I've always loved them. Always been my favorite vegetable. Like I just like would ride or die for them as a baby. And my third is like starches, but like vegetable starches. So like potato.
Like parsnips.
I love casserole. But like, okay, for Americans listening, casserole, like English casserole or Australian English casserole is different to your kind of tray bake casseroles, like green bean casserole is not what I'm talking about. Casserole is like, think of like a roast gravy, but sort of like zhuzhed up to be a little bit thicker. And then you've got like I get back, you know, again, before I was vegan, like slow roasted meat chunks in there. Slow stewed meat chunks.
Yeah, and
potatoes, like parsnips.
Chunky ass carrots.
Like that kind of food, like in a medieval tavern, I would like thrive.
I feel like that's not even the only reason that you would thrive at a medieval tavern.
No.
But you know, I'm ashamed to like dried fruit and I'm excited about a bittersweet autumn, and you can't wait to get your mouth around some casserole.
Listen, I'm waiting for that kind of like vegan-fy it, but I just don't want to like taint my memory. I kind of want that dish to like live on. But anyway,
we should talk later about vegan Worcestershire sauce. But anyway, carry on.
Okay. Well, you know, if you started this podcast thinking that you were going to get some queer history, you would be right. Just sometimes it takes us a while to get there, but that's the fun of the journey. We're here for the journey, not the destination. However, I will take you to the destination. So just strap your seatbelts on because
worst Uber driver ever.
Please, if you're listening to this and we've made you laugh at least once, you owe us a 5-star rating on Spotify. I don't make the rules, so that's all I say about that. But today, Hannah, I want to tell you the story, and I want to share the story with the listeners of the show, that of which is the life of the public universal friend.
My favorite. You picked one of my favorite stories.
Really?
Yeah, and I think what's going to be interesting about this is because it's one of my favorite stories, I know it very well.
Okay, good.
So I'm going to not be able to react with shock and awe, but I'm going to take immense pleasure and joy in you telling me one of my favorite bedtime stories.
Okay, great, because this is a doozy. So we're going to cover a lot of ground here now. I will preface my storytelling with the fact that the public universal friend, their life, you know, is sort of cushioned in religion. They, you know, we're going to speak a lot about religion today, and I'm kind of going to do a little 101. And as we said earlier, I didn't grow up in religion. I don't actually know the lived experience of someone who has grown up in religion. And of course, if you're listening and you're from the queer community, you know, in general, I think we have a lot of religious trauma, as does many people do. So I just want to preface the conversation with the fact that this is a comedy podcast, so it is going to be funny, but we are talking about things that may be a little sensitive or, you know, are kind of generalized in the way that we're talking about it. But, you know, as we always say, go and do your own research. There's plenty of information, like credible research. There's plenty of credible information out there, so you can always learn more. Now, before the public universal friend came to be known as such, they were born as Jemima Wilkinson, and we're kind of like birthday siblings. Hello, this is Editing Rudy. I am just dropping in to let everyone know that unfortunately 5 minutes of our audio was completely corrupted, and the only way you can hear me is through Hannah's microphone across the other side of the room. But after I said that their birthday was on November 29th, we basically just went on to talk about the fact that they had 8 siblings. And then that devolved into talking about colonization and how awful that is, obviously. And the fact that they actually had a cousin who was named Stephen Hopkins, and he was one of the members who signed the Declaration of Independence, which is why we started talking about colonization. I'm just going to drop you straight back into where the audio started working again. Bye. If you're wanting a visual descriptor of the public universal friend, they had black hair and black eyes, which I find an equally odd descriptor because I'm just like, why were their eyes so dark? Like, you know, like they literally were described as having dark eyes, like black eyes, which I don't know. I've never met like someone with black eyes, so who's like light of skin. So I don't know how, like, I feel like there's a demonization happening here, honestly.
I think definitely because I think, you know, and we spoke about this on the last episode, but there was just like a lot of mythologizing happening around, you know, that colonial period in New England where people would, anyone that was kind of different would be really quite kind of demonized. And there was a big fear of things like kind of witchcraft and the devil. And, you know, because the first people that settled were religious communities. We're going to talk.
Puritans, right?
Yeah. So the Puritans were some of the first ones. And, you know, it was really like they were very, very hung up on people that were possessed by the devil. So I think things like black eyes and things like that, there's almost something biblical about it. But yeah, I think there is a bit of mythologizing. I think we could probably just say dark brown.
I know, like that could have been all right, but no, we had to go the extra mile.
Unless they were like rolling through the fancy dress store or something like that.
Well, it had some sclera lenses on or
something like that.
Yeah. Now, early accounts of the public universal friend prior to their, I suppose, kind of taking on being the public universal friend, they were described as being fond of fine clothes and adverse to labor, which I find very relatable.
Ultimately, and also like weirdly Taurian, like that gives me a Taurus vibe rather than a Sagittarian vibe, but also, I mean, universally relatable.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I'm like, yeah, and like, because this quote was kind of being used as like, again, like that demonization tactic. And I'm just like, no, who wants to be doing labor? Not I.
I think, again, if you look at that kind of really puritanical society, like, for example, the Puritans, they would not wear, so they stood against things like slashed sleeves, which is like voluminous sleeves. They stood against lace.
Yes.
So any kind of finery was considered ungodly, but labor was the way in which you served God.
Yes.
So I think by calling somebody out for, one, enjoying fine clothing, and 2, being adverse to labor, that's a pretty big insult back in the 1700s.
Yeah. And speaking of Puritans and I guess religions, their parents were Quakers.
And the Quakers were a Rhode Island. So the religious communities set up in different areas, like the Puritans sort of settled in Massachusetts.
Yes.
You know, you had like the Baptists settle, and the Quakers did settle in Rhode Island, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. And, you know, I think Quakerism is something that I think is kind of, we hear, because I think the word Quaker at least reminds me of an apocalypse. I don't know about you.
It reminds me of oats. I think there's a brand of oats.
Quaker oats. It's probably because
I think
they're somehow related. But I just wanted to actually give like a little Quaker 101 because I feel like it's one of those things where, again, it's not sort of a religion that's mainstream in a way. And so at least, you know, in Europe, Europe and I guess like Australasia, we don't really have a lot of like Quaker sects and like Quaker meetings rather. And so let's just do a bit of a
I
101.
have seen Quaker TikTok.
Yes, really interesting
And I
stuff.
think I learned a lot of, well, basically the bulk of what I know about Quakers, which is not much, of Quaker TikTok.
Yeah. So let me give you a 101 on it, being a very quick and general one. So Quakers are people who belong to the Religious Society of Friends, which is already getting a tick in my book because I'm like, very welcoming. Friends, it sounds lovely. Like they probably serve tea and biscuits at their meetings.
I might get into religion if it was framed like that.
Exactly. Now, members of these movements or the Friends are generally united by a belief in each human's ability to experience the light within, which again, it's very like nice. Like there's nothing no speak of demons here.
Yeah, it's not about kind of avoiding hell or, sacrificing something for God. It's about, unleashing your best self.
I guess so. I mean, this metaphor though was it was a metaphor for Christ's light shining on or in them, and sort of like that sort of being, part of like their motivator in their everyday life. And the first Quakers were known to sit in silence and meditate on words of the Bible until they felt an inward light of God shining upon them, in which they would then like speak and, be heard, I suppose, by the rest of the meeting. Now, this reminded me of a scene, I think it was in Fleabag, where the priest took her to a Quaker meeting. Was it in Fleabag?
I've never seen Fleabag, despite being told I remind people of Fleabag.
Oh my
I've never
goodness.
seen it.
I feel like you need to see it. Now, I've just Googled to make sure that I wasn't lying about the Quaker scene, and it is... I would really recommend watching this scene because I think it is really funny, and it's what I would do if I went to a Quaker meeting. I think not out of intentional disrespect, just because sitting in silence is like kind of torture to me, like in a way, in most senses. But anyway, what's interesting about these kind of settled Quakers in America is that they were known to use thee as their ordinary or regular pronoun. So does thee want a cup of tea or something, so they didn't really use the word you or I. They said thee and thou or thy.
Was that, do you happen to know if that was something that everybody did at the time, or was it Quaker specific?
Well, it was Quaker specific because they were into something called plain speaking, which was sort of started at the beginning of the Quaker movement by a man named George Fox, and it was in an attempt to preserve the egalitarian view or philosophy, which is kind of like a political philosophy of prioritizing social equality.
So he was sort of saying if everybody speaks plainly, then we will erode the divide between like the well-spoken educated class and, those that didn't have access to education.
Yeah. That's what I understood from it.
That is, I've heard similar arguments. I think there is something that, they do teach you in English class, which is, don't use fancy words for the sake of it. Being understood is the most important thing. But I think there's so much to this idea of speaking plainly, because I do feel, at least in our culture in Australia, people that have English as a second language are so often kind of derided or, seen as lacking intelligence or, being less intelligent than somebody who speaks English as their native tongue.
Oh, yeah.
Even though like anyone who speaks English as a second language is doing far better than anyone who only speaks English because they've learnt one and probably more languages.
Yeah.
But I do think, that is something that I think about in terms of access to culture, access to society. We could do well for having a emphasis on plain speaking.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that.
They also weren't a fan of honorifics. So, which I'm like, that's a bit of a slay. So they didn't like using Miss, Mrs, Mr. Like they just again, because it like Captain can stay in my opinion.
I hate honorifics and I don't understand the point of them. And every time,
unless you're on like a ship, and then it's
if it's
important.
like captain or doctor or whatever. But even then, no.
It's just, I don't know. It's like really. Why are we making this class divide?
And why is it that like it has to say something about? Obviously it's well-trodden ground, but, Ms., Mrs., Miss, like.
What is that really saying?
I don't know. It's just sort of.
Nothing.
Yeah.
It's saying nothing.
Yeah, and it's always a drop down.
Yeah,
And you have to be mix.
I don't even see, that's the thing. I don't like, I'm glad it's there, but like we don't need it. Like, why do you need that? You don't. Sorry. Like, you're just lying to yourself. You're just making things more complicated. Maybe I'm starting to agree with this.
I'm on board.
So moving on, the Quaker principles can be summarized in a beautiful acronym called S.P.I.C.E.S. I know. It's a hot cross buns all over again. Now, this stands for simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality, and stewardship. So I don't want to go into all of those things because, you know, like I said, this is a 101 and I am not an advocate for one religion over the other. So this is just, I just want to kind of give the information and kind of go on with the rest of the story.
And I'm sure that there's like, you know, I'm sure like with all institutions or religions,
yes,
you know, these are distorted, you know, by us saying, oh, that sounds so nice. Whether or not like people have that experience as part of these communities, we don't know.
Exactly. And I will touch on that because I want to talk about Quakerism and the LGBTQ plus community, because I was like, okay, this is sounding quite nice, but like, is it though? And this isn't me, again, discrediting the whole religion. This is me just going, okay, but like, obviously we need to look at the intersectional relationship that this religion has with like people's lives. And so what I found was that it seems to be that it's, you know, like everything, it's a case by case basis as to whether Quaker meetings or, you know, these sort of society of friends accept LGBTQ plus people. Some are welcoming and are really like, obviously that's kind of part of their whole kind of thing that they sort of
equality, egalitarianism.
Yeah. So that's something that they sort of champion. Some are on the opposite end and are super intolerant and do not want anything to do with it. They're very anti-LGBTQ plus. And then some are sort of in the middle where this kind of complex nuanced ground of this sort of thing sits with religion. And I found this great quote that I can't stop saying to myself. I just love it. Oh. I don't know. It's because like I'm you know, we're Australian, but it's hate the sin, love the sinner.
I mean, that's like a reverse of something that I always hear, which is like love the sinner, hate the sin.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wait, what is yours?
No, like love the sinner, hate the sin.
Oh, so this is hate the sin, love the sinner.
Some reason the order makes that sound a little bit nicer.
Yeah.
But yeah, love the sinner, hate the sin is a very kind of, at least in, you know, Christianity, this idea of kind of reconciling the idea that, you know, God loves everybody, yet also hates gayness, queerness, you know, homosexuality. So the idea of that, like, you know, that's like the basis, I guess, for things like conversion therapy, where you have the idea of like a perfect divine being in a human who has gone on the wrong path or been tempted by the devil and is engaging in sinful behavior, and that can be easily corrected, versus like that behavior being an expression of an innate part of you.
Exactly. And so that's why I'm like, it does sit like, again, like I'm caveating this whole thing with like, it's complex beyond my comprehension for many reasons. And it's a quote like this, which, you know, it can, like, again, it's like it's a brainworm of mine, and I'm just like lolling at it because it's been stuck in my mind as like this like Southern drawl quote for like the last 24 hours. But it can so easily become very insidious. And like,
I mean, I reckon if you're listening and you have an experience, you know, being LGBTQ plus and a Quaker, positive, negative, in between nuance, please let us know. Like DM us on Instagram.
I would love to know. I would really love to know. Like it's one of those things that, you know, it's kind of hard to find stories on. So if you want to like drop us a little story time, you know, we'd love to hear it. Moving on to another tidbit that I found. You wouldn't happen to know a famous Quaker, would you? Maybe you do.
Just the one on the oats.
No, not him.
No, I don't think I do.
Hozier, you know, the folk artist, folk pop artist. I can't believe you don't know who. Hozier's like one of my favorite artists.
I know who the artist is, but was he born a Quaker or did he kind of convert or discover it later?
So he was brought up in the Quaker religion. He comes from like an Irish Catholic family, but his parents brought him and his siblings up in the Quaker religion. And he has a bit to say about it, which, you know, you can go and have a look at what he has to say in general. But I wanted to obviously bring this back to queer history, and I wanted to share that the song Take Me to Church, which is really his breakout song, is about his frustration with the Catholic Church and organized and institutionalized religion. And the video clip, which I don't know why I called it a video clip, it's a music video, actually sparked controversy at the time because it depicted a same-sex couple, so two guys, being violently attacked throughout the story of the video. And this is what he had to say about it. An act of sex is one of the most human things, but an organization like the church, say through its doctrine, would undermine humanity by successfully teaching shame about sexual orientation. The song is about asserting yourself and reclaiming your humanity through an act of love. He is like quite a staunch ally, to be honest. Like, he's been quite staunch about trans rights, and, you know, he's always sort of like doing like messages and like holding up flags and stuff at his concerts, as well as like, you know, I think he does a bit of charity work. And I just found it really interesting that people sort of don't, well, when I say people, apparently like lesbians love him, and he's like an honorary lesbian.
Lesbians
are really into this. But like, you know, like I just think it's really interesting how, you know, the mainstream really like took that song and were like, yeah, it's this like harrowing love song about love, when it was actually just like a big poo-poo on the Catholic Church.
A big poo-poo.
Yeah.
You know, what's interesting though is I think like there is something that we haven't had, you know, in recent decades in popular culture, but I do think that, you know, with some of the, you know, new artists, we are getting more representation in pop culture of people that have found a way back to religion and made it work with their identities.
Yeah.
You know, or engaging with the, you know, negative components of religion, but maybe like, you know, holding on to some parts that are meaningful for them. And we're starting to see people kind of, you know, songwriters or other artists engage with that. So the person that comes to mind for me is Ethel Cain, who I love.
Southern Gothic.
Southern Gothic is like my favorite aesthetic next to dark academia. But like, yeah, she is Baptist and definitely has the trauma of growing up Southern Baptist, yet also, you know, has like reconciled it with her identity and as a trans woman, and it comes through in her music. And I think that's something that's really cool, is that although I am not connected to religion or you're not either, but I think it's super cool when there are like young queer and trans people that are finding their way back to these institutions in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. It's one of those things. It's funny because it's like, I think we talk about religion a lot, but then at the same time, like the only experiences with religion that I have is my parents wanted me to like obviously go to like a good school, and so they like got me to apply for this like all girls, like I think it was Catholic maybe school. And I just remember like having to like know who this like saint was, and like making sure that I like didn't act out of like, I don't know, some kind, even at this point in time, like they weren't telling me like, oh, do this, do that. They were just like, this is an interview, and if you want to go to this school, then, you know, you kind of got to nail it. Even then,
Did you get in?
No, because I didn't want to. I think I don't know. I don't remember if I actually got accepted, but I remember just being like, no, I'm not doing that. But I remember like not having any like real grasp on religion, but then also kind of understanding that like I had to embody something. Yeah. Like, and I was like 10, 11, and I had to like embody something or someone for this interview for them to like accept me, because I understood that there was like this, on some level, that there was this huge weight to it. So I cannot, and this is just for like a school interview. It was like a 15-minute bit. Like, so I cannot imagine a lifetime of like
stepping into that persona in your life and living it every day.
Like, it's just astronomical. Like it's worlds away from what I understand. So I have a lot of like sympathy for like, for like, people who've experienced that. But I want to move past Quakerism, and now that I have a good understanding for like, you know, how we can like look at the public universal friend, let's actually find out how they became this public universal friend. So in the October of 1776, so they were about 24 years old, they contracted a disease that was most likely typhus and was bedridden, near death, with a high fever. And they had a death watch on for them, which I was like, what's a death watch? So they literally just sit there and watch them die, which I thought was quite macabre. And yes, you would be right in assuming that that is correct. I don't really know why, though. I kept Googling why did they do a death watch and death watch 1700s why and things like that. And it was all just kind of coming up with like old watchmakers. And I'm like, no, you guys don't get it. I want to know why they sat and watched people dying.
I mean, I think that was something that came out again in religious communities, the idea of like shepherding a soul into the afterlife, you know, and there would have been like religious practitioners there to help, you know, a soul reach the afterlife, heaven, safely. Yeah. So I think that's kind of where that came from.
Okay. So that makes a lot more sense. I was just thinking it was just like, oh yeah.
Like a spectator sport.
Well, no, just kind of like, yeah, I think they're going to die. Jim, do you mind just stepping in for a minute and just watching? Like I thought it was very like,
perfunctory.
Well, I thought maybe are they doing it so then they know exactly the time of death? Like I really wasn't sure. Anyway.
No, it definitely like they would have been doing like religious rites or like praying.
Okay. See, again, I don't have the
that's
experience. So after a few days, their fever broke and they survived. And this is where it starts to get really.
Did they survive though?
Well, this is where it gets contentious. Okay. It gets quite interesting. The friend, so we've gone from Jemima to the friend. So this is just so we're all on the same page of who I'm talking about. The friend later reported that Jemima Wilkinson, so her previous, I suppose, life and embodiment had died, and they had received revelations from God through two archangels who proclaimed that there was room in the many mansions of eternal glory for thee and for everyone. So during like their sickness, this had occurred and happened to them. And
wow.
And
what a fever dream.
Well, that's the thing. I was like, okay, number one, I was like, I have to find out the etymology of mansion because at first I was like, were they really using the word mansion in the 1700s? Like in the 1800s?
Like a built off the plan large home.
Well, that's the thing. I was like, is this being translated? I was like, no, they're speaking English. I was like, I got to double check that. Anyway, they were using the word mansion just so we all are on the same page. So I can say that this, you know, mansion just meant large house. Okay, just same meaning.
They did have access to large houses.
Exactly, and so this kind of also. Like kind of is corroborated, you know, they like the finer things in life. So yeah, I can understand why the archangel was like, yeah, we got a mansion. So they were like, yeah, holy shit, they've got a mansion, right? So the friend went on.
I mean, I think they were referring to like, you know, heaven, but go off. It's got like a cinema room.
Room in the many mansions of eternal glory. Okay, I'm talking about eternal glory, so let's call it heaven.
All I'm thinking of is Turak.
They should rename Turak to Eternal Glory. In the many mansions. They got a lot of houses there, and I'm like, anyway, I don't want to make too much of a joke of it. Anyway, the friend went on further to say that Wilkinson's soul had ascended to heaven and presumably taken up abode in one of the many mansions, and that their body had been reanimated with a new spirit charged by God with preaching his word by that of the name of the public universal friend. This name, the public universal friend, referenced the designation the Society of Friends used for members who traveled from community to preach. So that's what they call people. So like I guess... Yeah, people who went to different communities, they were like the public friend. They were friends to the public from the Society of Friends. Like you can also, it's just there's a lot of we use the word friend a lot here, and it does get confusing. So
yeah, so they were the public friend, but in this case, they were the public universal friend because it was actually about everybody.
Yes,
rather than Quakers.
Yes, exactly. So from then on, they refused to go by or answer to their birth name Jemima Wilkinson, and followers respected this and referred to them as the friend or Puff for short, so PUF, like an acronym. They identified as neither male or female, and they asked not to be referred to with gendered pronouns. And what I found really like, I don't know, like boss of them was that when they were asked about this, they said, I am that I am. So just like back off, bitch. Like
that's what I got it for too.
Yeah.
I mean, what an inspiration for a late in life gender reveal party, a public coming out, a shedding of the dead name, adopting of the true name, and an announcement of pronouns.
Yeah. Do you know what I wish now? If I had known about this story before I came out, what I would have done was like
got typhus?
No, I would have held like a reverse surprise party for my friends in which I kind of would have like spun it to be like a piece of performance art in which I lay on a bed in the center of the party, took a nap for 45 minutes and then awoken like and like announced my declaration of being trans.
That's good, but I would have left sometime in the 45 minutes that you were just sleeping.
You wouldn't have done a death watch for me? I thought we were friends.
I'd do a death watch for you, but that wouldn't be at a party at your house. I'd be attending at a funeral.
Okay.
Well, no, sorry, at a hospital.
The pre-funeral.
But I think you've got some areas to work on before you get that like performance art.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, what's interesting though is like I think it's probably worth looking at the fact that, did this really happen? Like how did a vision from God kind of come in and tell you to do this? Like it feels far-fetched for anybody that doesn't have like a belief in God having that sort of power. But I think what's interesting is, again, like their lives were very, very simple back in the 1700s.
But like the Quakers lived by this sense of simplicity. Like that was like the backbone of like how they went about things.
Yeah, so life was very simple, and like there wasn't a big understanding of dreams, of abstract thoughts.
The Enlightenment hadn't happened in America yet, right?
No,
yeah.
But essentially there wasn't a real idea of like, so it could have been, a dream, a fever dream, a little bit of deliriousness through fever, and it's quite.
And you're probably right, or they had this sort of like feelings and sort of articulation, and then they were on the brink of death and they thought, wow, I really came out on top. Well, one life, one shot, one opportunity.
Definitely they were channeling Eminem.
Yeah.
I think that's what this is really about.
This is really bad.
They
Marshall
had like,
Mathers.
and then they came up and they asked for Mum's spaghetti.
Exactly. They present. This is really getting away from us.
We're going to need to do some editing on this one.
No, I'm leaving it in. They presented, so as we spoke about earlier, the weird black eyes that they would describe having, which is probably inaccurate. Now they presented in a manner that was perceived as androgynous or masculine, in long, loose clerical robes, which were mostly black, and worn with a white or purple kerchief, which is a neck handkerchief for uncultured swines, or a cravat. And I'm like, Matt Preston?
Matt Preston.
I know. Wow. I wonder
my gosh.
if the Public Universal Friend was on Matt Preston's early fashion mood board.
I think so. Matt Preston, if you don't know, it was a former judge of Australian MasterChef.
Yes. Very eccentric fashion sense.
Yeah, totally. And I believe the Public Universal Friend also rocked a hell of a mullet. They had like very cropped hair on top with like really long curls.
Yeah, I think so from memory. And they were described by someone as decent and graceful and grave, which I would hope I'm described as, to be honest with you. Yeah. Decent and graceful and grave. They're like three very distinct adjectives. And I'm like, I kind of vibe it. Like grave.
I actually think, my fiance ticks those boxes. She's a Cancer. She's sort of like got that, she's got a graveness to her. She's very graceful, and she's obviously, I think she's decent, but I do think she's grave. Did you see
that video our friend sent us of like what it would be like if the lights went out and you were in the 18th century?
Yes.
And it's like, sister, you must come. Where is Chod? I must call mother. Like I'm afraid you might not make it through the night. Like, that's the grave, right?
That is
yeah.
that is grave. That is grave.
So they're the public universal friend, but what did they do? Like, they didn't just like kind of get into farming after this revelation.
Still adverse to labor.
No, they are still adverse to labor. What they're not adverse to is preaching. And so they began to travel and preach throughout New England colonies. This is the thing. No Bible, just spoke and spat verses like Eminem from memory. And they had meetings that attracted large audiences, including some of whom formed a congregation of universal friends, making the Friend the first white American to found a religious community, which I put the caveat of white in there. It was not in the source material, but I was like, come on, people, like, these guys are colonizers.
Call
like,
a spade a spade.
Exactly. So, which I found interesting because I'm like, okay, you really went out on a limb. You really had nothing to lose. You really did feel the sense of impending death.
One of my favorite things about this story, this isn't even one of my favorite things. That comes at the end. But when I was researching for the book, was looking into some of the people that joined the Society of Universal Friends, and a lot of them were just kind of single women who didn't want to get married because the Society of Universal Friends, the public universal friend, preached that, you should marry God and not a man.
Yes.
And I feel like I want to like say that to all my single straight friends.
Yes. And we're going to get into more of that.
Oh my God, I jumped the gun. This was the downside of you choosing one of my favorite stories.
I'm enjoying that. Like, I'm not just kind of reeling off these like 5 pages of notes too. What is important, I think, to note is that when this occurred in their life and they sort of took up this sort of post of, I guess, speaking words from God, because in Quakerism, like, they sort of believe that God speaks through you. And so they're not really kind of recounting things. I think that, like, God, like, they believe that God is actually like kind of coming through. You're like the mouthpiece, like as the lyrics in Hozier's Take Me to Church would say, if the heavens ever did speak, she was the last true mouthpiece.
Right.
Okay, now it's all making sense.
Right.
Making sense.
Yes.
Okay, so we can kind of draw some parallels to the public universal friends preaching. But the Society of Friends, they were not happy, like, really, with this sort of outlier in their sort of community, and they disowned the public universal friend. So the friend was disowned, which is obviously why they kind of had to create their own religious community. Now, what were they preaching? In 1788, someone said, "From common report, I expected to hear something out of the way in doctrine, which is not the case. In fact, I heard nothing but what is common among preachers." Basically, put simply, they were just reading from the book. Like, they weren't kind of, I guess, bastardizing anything that the Society of Friends were already saying. Like, they weren't kind of like spouting anything unusual, for Quakerism. They kind of were just like doing things like, any other preacher from.
Is that kind of, quote sort of saying, leave them be, they're not causing any harm?
Well, I guess, like, yeah, kind of very like, well, I don't know what, they don't seem kind of weird to me. I don't know what you're talking about, which I find interesting because I'm like, yeah, you're just judging a book by its cover and its traumatic death experience. If I'm being really honest.
You're just judging a book by its traumatic death experience.
Yeah, which I find quite disrespectful, if I'm honest with you. But aside from that, they went around and they were preaching ideas of rejecting predestination, which is basically to say that they believed in free will or free will by the hand of God. They called for the abolition of slavery, and they would persuade their followers who held people in slavery to free them.
I love that.
I know. And this was noted across a variety of sources, and I did not delve too deep into it, but a lot of them highlighted the fact that they had quite a large number of Black members in their congregation, and the friend that is would encourage these members to be the witnesses to the signing of the sort of freeing of slaves.
Yeah.
And apparently that was kind of, it was seen as like a kind of a good thing. I have a question mark on the end of that because I'm not actually sure if that was a good thing, but it seemed to have been something that was seen to be empowering or something like along those lines.
Well, Quakers in general were anti-slavery.
Yes.
You know, they sort of stood for teetotalism, anti-slavery. It's all egalitarianism,
Yes.
which is, as we know, S.P.I.C.E.S. But I think, yeah, like the Society of Universal Friends, the Friend did have a big impact on them because, you know, as a result, many of them did, you know, turn towards emancipating, you know, enslaved people, which, you know, it's kind of hard to say that's great because that shouldn't have been held there in the first place. But, you know, I guess within the culture and the context, the public universal friend did have an impact, or was at least preaching values that today better align.
Yeah, exactly. And on the point of women, like you said earlier, mentioning that they were like, you know, kind of obey God and not man. That's exactly what the Friend said. And on that, some of the most committed followers who were women included roughly 4 dozen unmarried women. So yes, there was like married women who were in these sort of meetings, but roughly 4 dozen key members were unmarried women known as the Faithful Sisterhood, who took on roles of the sort that were often reserved for men and would often take on dressing similarly to the Friend as well. So androgynous, or sort of starkly against what women were sort of wearing in terms of fashion at the time.
I feel like you and I would have signed up instantly.
Maybe.
I would have.
I probably would have died of typhus.
Of typhus.
Yeah, before I could get that far. But maybe. I don't know. What would I have done? I've got to look into that. Maybe we should think about what we would have done, like for work.
All right, we can think back on that. But I do think that I would have been drawn to the group.
Yes, I think I would have been too. Their preaching went on for many years, and around 1785, the Friend met Sarah and Abraham Richards, and they were a married couple, except their marriage ended in 1786, just a year after they met the Friend, where Abram died on a visit to the Friend. And I lost it at this point. I was like, oh, died on a visit to the Friend, did he? That's curious. That's quite mysterious, isn't it? And I tried to look up to see how he died, where he died, what he, you know, like the whole kit and caboodle. Do you think I could find anything? No. Couldn't find anything apart from the fact that he died on a visit to the Friend, which I find very curious. Now, I'm not accusing anyone. I'm just saying it's curious. And I'll leave it at that. Now, Sarah and their daughter started living with the Friend after Abraham had died and took up a similar visual expression as the Friend, as many of the women did, and changed her name to Sarah Friend. And when she died, she left her child in the Friend's care. So Boston marriages, you know, you said in the last episode, it was around the same area, kind of similar time within this like kind of same century and a half. So interesting, very interesting.
Do people speculate that Sarah and the public universal Friend had a sort of spiritual relationship?
The speculation that I found did come from sources that were looking historically through a queer lens. Those that didn't really sort of brushed over, like they always do. They just brushed over it. So there's not actually a lot of information. A lot of the information that sort of comes out of the time period where Sarah was involved in the Friend's life is more to do with the Friend trying to set up like some land and a community on some land, and that it was sort of more about the financial stuff.
Sort of supporting Sarah. Okay.
Yeah. So like, again, it wasn't really about the relationship. So by 1816, the Friend began suffering from a painful edema, which is fluid retention, but continued to receive visitors and give sermons. They died on July 1st in 1819, and the congregation's death book.
I will always remember this quote.
Yes. The congregation's death book records 25 minutes past 2 on the clock, the Friend went from here, which is so spooky. It's so it's creepy. I
think it's beautiful.
It is beautiful, but like you like Southern Gothic, and I do too. It's also creepy.
Oh, I think it's beautiful because this idea of the Friend had, or at least the Friend's body had 2 deaths, right?
Yes.
If we say the one,
you mean
the death of Jemima, and then the death of the public universal Friend.
Wait, their Friend, their body didn't. They like
according to them.
No, they didn't say my body died. They said Jemima died.
Yeah, and then their body was reanimated with a new spirit.
Oh, yeah, I guess so.
So I'm like, the body's kind of experienced two deaths. But and they had this death watch. And I think the death watch is about farewelling a soul or like sending someone on a spiritual journey. So they didn't have the death watch then really, but the second death, they did. They were observed kind of, you know, the friend went from here.
Yeah.
They were finally delivered safely to the afterlife or
the many
wherever
mansions.
they were, the many mansions.
Yeah.
You know, they, you know, finally got to watch the Back to the Future trilogy in the cinema room.
That's a really niche choice.
But yeah, I think it's beautiful, and I want that to be in my death book.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of does send shivers down your spine. And on top of that, the friends' wishes for their death was respected, and only a regular meeting of their society was held, and no funeral service was had afterwards. On top of that, the body was placed in a coffin with an oval glass window set on top, which I can only assume means so that you can see their face, which, okay, I'm not going to yuck anyone's yum. And and that was put in a thick stone vault in the cellar of their house. And I desperately want to see this vault.
Is it still there? I'm going to look up.
Just wait. I've looked it up already for you. God, get the fingers off the keyboard. Gosh. The house still stands in the town of Jerusalem, which I initially was like, wait, at what point did they go to Jerusalem? But this being New England and them being colonizers, it's not. It's a Jerusalem.
They just made a new Jerusalem.
They made a new Jerusalem.
Should have been called New Jerusalem.
Well, I think that would have been too much of a tongue tie. But it's in Yates County, New York, and it's the house itself is included on the National Register of Historic Places. So you can, I believe, still visit it.
Hang on, if the friend was stored in the cellar in a coffin with a glass window, what happened to the body?
Well, several years later, the coffin was removed and buried in an unmarked grave in accordance with the friend's preference. So we actually you can't go visit the grave. Like I think people probably would know where it is, but it's not like a tourist attraction.
Okay.
Yeah. So numbers of their congregation slowly dwindled, and the Society of Universal Friends disappeared by the 1860s. So that's really where their life ends and their sort of story finishes and gets tied up. But I wanted to sort of leave with a few things to think about when you walk away from this story, because I think that there is a few things that are going on and that, you know, we didn't kind of touch on so much during the telling of their life. But I think it's important, not so much for us to talk about, but for you to like go away and have a think about, because, you know, of course, like we don't do homework, but it's good to think about things sometimes, you know? So what I found was that there was a really bad coverage by historians when it came to the friend's life, in that they would inaccurately portray the friend as a woman and disregarded, you know, their history or their story or their life and experiences with gender. And even if we take away like their sort of modern, if we put a modern lens on it, like their non-binary identity perhaps, even if we took that away and we didn't talk about that, even the sense of like expression through clothing and what they did in like their society, like a lot of historians just kind of wanted to ignore that and just wanted to sort of really go down this religion rabbit hole, which again, like is not very intersectional, which I found quite disappointing. And then some of them would go as far to say, like, basically discredit like the friend's entire life and just say that you know, they were a fraudulent trickster and they were a con artist and that they were taking advantage of people and that they didn't believe what they were saying and that they were, you know, this financial burden that they got themselves into trying to make this community was like this whole big scheme. And I just don't like that. I don't know. I
do think what's interesting about that is it ties into a lot of how trans people, in particular non-binary people, well, I guess, yeah, trans people today are still accused of trickery. Like one
Yes.
thing we've seen throughout history, every time we look at transgender stories in history, there's always this idea of like, oh, you're doing this to be fraudulent, or you're trying to trick me
Yes.
by, disguising who you are. And I think it makes perfect sense that with somebody who defied binary gender, that was the criticism of them, by historians, because that is a pretty big theme.
Yeah, exactly. And, they wouldn't have been called transgender. They wouldn't have been called non-binary. They wouldn't have been called gender diverse, at the time, because we literally did not have that language. There was no way for them to really articulate it in the way that we would today. And, just as much as it is sort of like harmful to say that they were a trickster, I think if we're going down that hardcore line of being like, oh, they were transgender and they were the blah, 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 like, I think that is also harmful in that, like, again, you're not being intersectional about it. You're not understanding the religious experiences and life that they led, which I think was more important to them than their gender. Their life didn't really revolve around their gender. It was their life revolved around their religion. And that's not to like cancel one or the other out, but I think that like I did read some queer takes which I felt were more hot takes than actual like into like academic criticism.
I think what is interesting that I take from this story is so often people that defy gender norms, at least, in the recent century, last century, have been derided as ungodly or against God or perverting God, that kind of language. But when you look at, indigenous cultures indigenous cultures all throughout the world, a very, very strong thread throughout so many different indigenous peoples is having multiple genders. We've seen that in many, we'll do a full episode, many episodes that kind of explore this further. But often in these cultures, and in particular in North America, indigenous tribes would have people of third genders that held, positions of spiritual importance for the people. So there was like a spiritual or enlightened element to having people that defied gender norms. The idea of that being a really important or honorable kind of gender identity because it made you closer to God or whichever God. I'm using kind of like little g God.
Yeah. Little g.
I'm using little g. The idea of like that making you closer to God. And I think that is something that, was just one of the biggest travesties of colonization among many, many others was the erasure of the fluidity of gender.
Yeah.
However, what's interesting when you look at the public universal friend is, very rare in, European history, with the exception of things like eunuchs and, very, very rare in European history do we have somebody who was genderless, again, in a sense that they were closer to God.
Yeah.
And I think that the public universal friend is somebody who like represents, I guess, that.
Yeah. Yeah. I find it I just find the whole thing really interesting. And I'm like, it's stories like this that I'm like, I kind of, when like super religious people now who are part of like, really terrible mega cults, mega churchy, groups who are really conservative, I'm just like, you're not even looking at history. Like, come on, like open another book, maybe just for once.
Different kind of book.
Yeah. Like, yeah, it's, I find it, a little bit infuriating, but it's important to tell these stories, but it's also important, like you said, to recognize that like this was, essentially a white colonizer and they did some good things, but they were a colonizer and, like there's no excuse for that. So, I'm really excited to get into some other, indigenous stories about gender and kind of crack that open because it just, what can I say? It really irks me. But there you go. It's a really fun story, I think. And the life of someone who seemed to have quite a profound impact on the people around them is really interesting, particularly when you look at the wider, I guess, stories of what was going on during that time. What a little like pocket rocket of a place in New England. There was a lot going on, a lot of diseases.
A lot going on in New England.
New England, more like new stuff going on I've learned about recently.
Well, in that case, hey, thanks for listening. Thanks for telling me, there was so much more I learned about Quakerism.
Really?
And yeah, I think it was great. Excellent retelling of one of my favorite stories about one of my favorite historical figures. And if you like the, Public Universal Friend, it is, they are mentioned. There's a passage on them in the Rainbow History Class book, which is out now. You can get it on audiobook as well, read by Rudy Jean Rigg and written by moi. You can find out heaps more information on our socials, Rainbow History Class. And if you want to support the show, you can do what?
Oh, you can join our Patreon and become a class cutie, and you can help keep the podcast alive and running. And in return, we give you little treats in the form of exclusive content. Things like we do twice monthly exclusive videos. We also do things like put up pre-sale. I say pre-sale, but like we'll put the link for shows in the Patreon like earlier than we would anywhere else. Anything. Basically, Patreon's where you want to be. If you want to be in the know, you want to be in the community, get on Patreon and join us there. Otherwise, we can catch you somewhere else on the internet because we are everywhere. You cannot escape us.
And like we always say, not everything is gay, but there is gay in everything.